The next tool we want to look at within Vue is attribute binding. And just as a little refresher of our HTML knowledge, attributes are just extra configuration information we give to HTML elements. For example, for the HTML element image, we typically include a source attribute where we can specify the path to the image that we want to load. We'll also include things like a alt attribute to indicate an alternate text description of that image. And I've got a couple other examples here of other attributes we commonly use within our HTML elements. Now, where attribute binding comes in with Vue is it allows us to dynamically set values for these attributes. And the way that we do that is using the Vue directive vbind. As an example of this, I want to work an image into our Flashword example so far. And I went ahead and put an image on a server that we could use for this. Let me go ahead and load this path so you can see what we're going to be working with. All right, so we just got a little green check mark that we can display when they get the answer correct. And then there's also a version of this for incorrect, which displays a red X. And what I'd like to do is dynamically choose one of those images to display as part of our feedback. So if they get the answer correct, not only should we see our feedback message, we should also see that green check mark and then the red X if they get it incorrect. So to set this up, let's go over to our code. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a new data property that will be set to the appropriate image path depending on whether or not they got it correct. So let's just create a data property. We'll call it image. I'll go ahead and initialize it as null. When we first load the page, we don't know if it's correct or incorrect. But then down here in our check answer, this is where we're going to set that value. So what I'll do is after we know if correct is true or false, we're going to use that to influence what image we want to set. So we'll say if this correct, in other words, if correct is true, then we want this image to be the path to our correct image. This will be the green check mark. Otherwise, we'll use an else here. This image will be set to the incorrect image path. So now that we've got that data property set up, let's go over to our template. And down here in our feedback element, we're going to put an image on the page. And the way that we're going to set the source for this image is we're going to use the vbind directive. And we're going to indicate what we want to be binding here, which is going to be the source. And then we're going to set it to our image data property. So now that source will be dynamic depending on whatever image is set to within our JavaScript. Let's test this out. I'll start with a correct answer. All right, perfect. There's our green check mark. And let's do a incorrect answer. And it swaps out to that red X. So that works. But another way that we can handle this is if we look at the image path, for both of the images, it's basically the same path, right? It's coming from the same server. It has the same extension. The only thing that is different is part of the image name. It's either correct or incorrect. So rather than repeating this full path, what if we just made that part dynamic? Let me show you what I mean. So instead of setting it to be the full path, we're going to set image to be, in this case, for the correct image, we'll just say correct. And then down here, we'll set it to incorrect. And then the path for the image, we're not going to include this in our JavaScript anymore. Instead, what we'll do over in our template is we're going to set our source to be a string that has the full URL and the full extension. But then just for this part of the image name, we're going to make this dynamic. So I'll get rid of that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to concatenate in our image data property. So I'm going to stop the string with a quote, right? Because the string itself starts here with this double quote. So I'm going to stop it. Then I'll use our JavaScript concatenation character, the plus sign. Then I'll reference my image data property. And then to go back into the string, I'll use the plus sign again, and then begin the string again with a double quote. Let me go ahead and zoom out just a little bit here so we could see that all on one full line. So we've got string plus our data property plus the end of our string. We put it all together, we should get a full image path. Let's give it a shot. Good, there's our green arrow, and there's our red X. So that's the basics of working with that vbind directive. Just a couple other little follow-up things to know about it. The first is there is a syntax shortcut for it. So just like for von, we could shorten that to just an @ sign. With vbind, you can shorten it to just a colon. Not something I'll do in my examples just because I do like to be a little bit more explicit, but that option does exist if you like those shortcuts. Another note as it relates to vbind is sometimes rather than using vbind, what people will try to do when setting attribute values is they'll try to use text interpolation. right? Because we know that text interpolation in Vue, it's just going to inject some value into our HTML. So why couldn't we do something similar like that with our attributes? For example, let's say we wanted to set an alt on this image. I'm going to add an alt attribute, and let's come up with a data property. We'll call it image alt. And we will try to use text interpolation to just inject that as our alt value. All right, and of course we need to actually set this up. So I'll go back to my JavaScript and I'll set some values for this. All right, so we've got that data property. This seems logical, right? Why can't we just text interpolate it to our alt attribute? Well, it's not going to work. But let me go ahead and show that. So we'll refresh our example. All right, and it's hard to see on the page because the alt is not something that is visible on the page. But if we look in our web inspector, we could see what's actually happening here. And you could see the alt, it's never actually rendered. We're still seeing that text interpolation there. All right, so that's not going to work. Text interpolation will not work to just like output values for an attribute. We have to use vbind here. And I'll go ahead and correct this. So we'll do vbind alt, and we'll set it to be that image alt data property. Refresh our example. Look at the document, and there you can see the alt was actually rendered as expected. So long story short, text interpolation and HTML attributes, they don't mix. The tool you want to be using there is vbind. Moving on, I want to talk about some interesting things you can do with vbind when it comes to CSS related styling, specifically when you're working with the class or the style attribute. And for the first example of this, let me go back to the notes. We're down here under the section of class and style binding. The first set of techniques I want to talk about is class binding with objects. What this allows you to do is to dynamically bind a class to an element using this object syntax. And the way that this is going to work is the property you're going to set in your object is going to be some class that you want to potentially apply. And then the value will be some Boolean expression that if it evaluates to true, that class will get applied. Whereas if it evaluates to false, the class won't get applied. To see this in action, let's work it into our Flashware demo. And what we can do, let's start to add some like form validation. All right, so let's say they don't enter an answer and they submit the form. Let's give them some feedback, letting them know there was a problem. And just to set this up, let's introduce some data properties for this. So let's say we have a data property called has error that's going to indicate whether or not the form has an error. And to begin with, we'll set it to false. We can assume when we first load the page, there aren't any errors. But then down here, when we're checking the answer, the first thing we're going to do is make sure we actually have an answer. So if the answer is a blank string, at that point, we will toggle our has error data property to true. And then what we could do at that point too is we can return or exit this method, right? Because if there is an error, we don't want to execute the rest of this code. All right, so now that we have that data property, coming back to our template, starting off with just like some basic text output on the page, we'll let them know if it has an error. So we'll integrate a paragraph that we will conditionally display. So we'll say if has error, and it says you must enter a answer. And the other thing I want to do for the input itself, I want to dynamically add a class to this input that is going to style it and draw attention to the input just to emphasize and support the feedback that we're giving them. So in anticipation of that, let's go ahead and set up a class for this. I'm just going to call it error. And what we'll do is we'll set it to be a background color of light pink. And then to dynamically apply that class to this input, we're going to use vbind. We're going to set a class, and here's where we're going to use our object syntax. So the key will be the class we want to potentially apply, which is going to be error. And then our true false value as to whether that will be applied is going to be that has error data property we had created. All right, so if has error is true, this error class will be applied. If it's false, it won't be applied. And let's go ahead and test that out. So I'm going to submit my form without entering an answer. And perfect. It draws attention to our input. We see that error class was applied. And of course, if we pull this up in our web inspector, we should be able to see that behind the scenes. So there's that class error. The other thing we should expect is that once we enter an answer and submit it again, that error should go away. But we haven't actually done anything in our JavaScript yet to toggle that has error data property back to false. So just coming back here and check answer, what we're going to do is after this if statement, I will set this has error to false because we can assume that if we didn't have an error, we didn't return out of this method, so we should get to this point. It should toggle has error to false and continue on with the rest of our method. All right, so now we can submit it with an error. We get our feedback. We see our styling as expected. But now if we enter an answer and submit it again, that's cleared out. And you can see down here, the class was actually removed. We don't have any classes being applied to this input. So that's one neat little trick you can do with vbind and class binding. This object syntax, it's almost like a little mini if statement in here, right? Because we're saying if some true false value, then apply this class. And this is one of those tools you're going to find yourself reaching for a lot when building applications, because a lot of interface development is just about manipulating CSS. So being able to apply and remove classes on the fly like this is really useful. And knowing that, let's go back to the notes because there's some additional things we could do with this that will be helpful to know about. One being that you can expand on your objects. So let's say there's multiple classes you want to potentially apply. You could just add them as additional elements to your object, right? So in this case, the class error and critical could potentially be applied here, depending on whether our has error and our hypothetical is critical data property is true or false. You can also combine this with just a regular class attribute, right? So let's say your element always needs to have some class applied to it that isn't dependent on some data property. You could just set that like you would any other class and use that in combination with some dynamic class binding, right? You could see how that could potentially be rendered. Basically, when Vue interprets this, it'll just smush it all down to just a regular class attribute. In addition to class binding with objects, you can also class bind with arrays. And this is used in situations where there's multiple classes that you would want to bind to an element. Let's say those classes are being set as like data property values. You could just combine them together with an array. And you can also see how this could actually be used in combination with that object syntax. So an element of your array could be one of those object expressions. And then finally, let's say you want to apply some styles, but you don't want to do it on a class basis. You want to do it like on an individual style property basis. You can also do binding with the style attribute. Let's go ahead and work up an example of this. So let's say we want to apply a background color to our input. We don't want to rely on the error class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this vbind to a style binding. And then for our object, the key is going to be the particular style property we want to apply, which in this case, it's going to be the background color. And then the value should be whatever color we want it to be, which we will make dependent on some data property. Let's call it input background color. All right, so let's make sure we set this up in our JavaScript. And what we'll do is we will initialize it to be white. And then down here, if we have an error, we will change it to light pink. And then similarly to how we had to toggle our has error back to false down here, if we made it past this check, we would want to toggle it back to white down here. All right, so now that should be able to dynamically set a background color. Before we run this though, one note about the style properties that we're using. When we're writing them in our Vue templates, we can't just write them with the hyphenated style that we usually use in CSS. We have to convert it to either camel case, or if we want to use the hyphen, we just have to surround that property in quotes like so. So let's go ahead and test this out, make sure it's working basically the same as it was before. We're just using a different technique to do that styling. So I'm going to submit my form without any answer. And there we go. We're still seeing that light pink. Let's look at how this is being handled behind the scenes. All right, there we go. So there's our dynamic style being applied inline. Our background color is set to light pink. Whereas if we enter an answer and we submit our form, it gets toggled back to white. So like I said, same outcome, just a different approach. And to be honest, for something like this with like background colors, I would go with the class-based styling. Where the inline styling like this could be useful is where you're dealing with a lot more variations in the styles. Let's say, I don't know, let's say the feedback is going to be a different font size on a scale of like 10 through 35 with every increment in between. you wouldn't have to want to create classes for each of those increments. In that case, it would make sense to just have like a dynamic property that was some numerical value that represented the font size, and you could inject that into the style. That would be a better use case for the style approach. But at the end of the day, a lot of these things can accomplish the same things. And that's one of the things you're going to notice the more and more we learn about Vue is there's going to be different ways of doing things that have pros and cons and will come down to personal preference. And you'll start to have to, pick which tool is the best for the job. But with that, this is where I'm going to conclude our discussion of attribute binding. We'll definitely get an opportunity to see some more examples of this as we continue to develop our Flashword application. But now in the next part of the series, we're going to turn our attention to our forms and look at form input binding.